Well, thank you for coming. We still got a few people probably filtering in. I'm Mark Levin, Director of the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, as well as Policy Director for Right on Crime, which is our national initiative. And it's great to see everyone here. And we are really happy to be kicking off the first of what are 4 panels today covering various criminal justice issues. And my colleagues are here as well, Vikrant Reddy, Jeanette Mull, our policy analyst in the center, and then just walking in, our new Director of Communications for Right on Crime, Brendan Steinhauser. And so this is really an exciting topic, and it's one we've been really focused on since the Center for Effective Justice launched back in March of 2005, and that is empowering and restoring victims of crime. And what we saw as we kind of looked at the way the criminal justice system had evolved in this country, that victims were really, their role had diminished to a large degree over time. And so, of course, if you go back to colonial America, there were victims were able to bring their own prosecutions. There were some areas where there simply weren't any professional prosecutors. Obviously, we've evolved a lot, and some of that is necessary. We have a much larger population, a more disconnected population, a more transient population, and so and a more complicated and adversarial and lengthy court system and process. So certainly, obviously, we need prosecutors, but I think it's also important to go back and say the reason that most things we have are crimes is because a victim was harmed, and that one of the primary goals of the criminal justice system is to ensure that the victim both has a say in the resolution of the case, as well as is ultimately put back as much as possible in the position they were in before the harm of the offense took place. And so, unfortunately, we've seen cases where, for example, someone will pay thousands in fines and the victim still hasn't gotten restitution. And that's a clear example of where, the government's prerogatives of the fines is taking precedence over making the victim whole. And so what we've tried to embark upon is research that would look at what are some ways of, within the modern framework of the criminal justice system, giving victims a greater role in the process and creating processes where they can, they're more likely to be restored in an efficient and streamlined process. And one of the things that we've been able to see from the research is that, contrary to some opinions, a greater role for victims does not mean defendants have to lose their rights. In fact, it can go hand in hand with a system that also restores the defendant to a productive member of society and involves the community and neighborhoods in public safety. And so a number of examples, of course, include victim offender conferencing, which we'll be discussing today. And in Vermont, they have reparative sentencing boards, which have been very effective, where community members come together and kind of sit around, kind of like the restorative sentencing circles that are seen on most Indian reservations, and informally arrive at an appropriate resolution of the case. So I think that overall what we see with restorative justice is a move towards a system that's less adversarial, less focused on procedures and procedures that can take months or years, and more focused on achieving an outcome that is beneficial to both the victims, the defendants, and the community. So we really have a great opportunity here today to further explore these ideas with our 3 panelists, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce our first speaker today, who's going to be Tim Dunn. And many of you know that Tim was really really had the idea originally for creating the Center for Effective Justice back in 2005, and so it really has been a pleasure to be able to try to execute what I think was an incredible vision that he had for this work. And he is a founder of the Midland Classical Academy, where he serves on the Board of Trustees, a small business owner in Midland, Texas, and of course is vice chairman of our board here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Tim Dunn.
Thank you, Mark. When Brooke brought Mark on board, one of the things she said was that he worked like a whole staff, and I've found that to be true. He's been an incredible asset for this cause and for Texas Public Policy Foundation. Well, I'm going to give us a brief philosophical underpinning to this whole topic of victim. And when you talk about justice, of course, we could spend the whole time talking about what is justice. It's the subject of one of the greatest books of Western civilization, Plato's Republic, the whole question, what is justice? But with respect to victim, I think it's not that hard. When you have an offense, there's a victim, and in justice, we should restore the victim and deter further harm in an impartial manner. That seems like a reasonable definition. And in a society like ours, under a Texas Constitution and in America, the goal of this system as a whole is to protect liberty, so individuals can be free to interact with one another and within these bounds. So then consider under the Agricultural Code of the state of Texas that it's a Class B misdemeanor, a crime, to mislabel a container of citrus fruit. So you ask your question, who is the victim of that crime? The fruit? The can? The label? Who is the victim? And unfortunately, in our particular circumstance in Texas, we are morphing into a situation where more and more the victim of the crime is not an individual citizen, it's the government. This is not the structure of a liberty-loving state protecting freedom. It's the structure of a police state, perpetuating the power of government. It's something that if we're conservatives and we're not paying attention to this, we're totally missing the main point of criminal justice. I'll give you an example. At the federal level, there was a man in Idaho who had a contract with the local county to keep a stream clear because it was a drainage for a development. The stream only flowed about two months a year. And during the permitting process and so forth, the Corps of Engineers repeatedly said they had no jurisdiction and so forth, and this guy had been doing it for a long time, I think since 1980. And a new EPA administration came in and decided he was defiling this stream with sediment every time he cleared it. The man was convicted, sent to prison for a year for clearing the stream. Under this law, he had to restore the stream. That was part of the thing. When you have environmental crimes, you have restoration. But him, this citizen, this individual, went to jail during his daughter's senior year, who was without both parents because her mother died of heart failure shortly after all the abuse from the government started. Who is the real victim of crime? In our current system, take the situation where, let's say you are victimized by burglary, and let's say I'm the government. And I come to you and say, well, what would you like to see happen now your car's stolen? If you're like most people, if you're like the people who answered this survey of Iowa burglary victims, you would say, I'd like to have my car back, which 81.4% of the respondents to this survey said. And that's what I would want. I would want my car back. But that's not the way our system works. We don't care about your car. We don't care about you. The way our system works is me as the government would say, well, we don't care about you. You're the little person. What we're going to do is find the perpetrator. If we feel like it, we're going to throw him in jail where he can go get trained to be a much better criminal. And you're going to pay for it at $15,000 a year or whatever it's up to now. So you get mugged twice. Once by the perpetrator and the second time by the government.
40,000 plus.
40,000, okay. So we've got it kind of messed up, and restoring the victim status to an individual, a citizen, is vital for us if we're going to have a state based on liberty. How did this all get messed up in the first place? Well, William the Conqueror, back 1,000 years ago, actually started this because in England the system was that if you had a dispute, they would pay the restitution. And the king decided, well, these are all my subjects, and I own everybody. So if there's a restitution paid, it should be paid to me. So every time we say the state of Texas versus, and we ignore the victim and we ignore restoration, we're actually making a claim that the government owns all of us. The basic idea is, yeah, you lost your car, but I, the government, have been harmed because you're my taxpayer, and I own you. The only extent to which I let you keep you should just be thankful I let you keep anything at all, because it's all mine. And the fact that you lost your car is just tough luck. I'd let you keep it in the first place. It's an imperial claim. And this imperial form of justice is not in keeping with our history. of liberty in our country. We could all end up like Michael Morton. In February of 1987, Michael Morton, just north of Austin, was convicted of a brutal rape and murder of his wife. 25 years later, he was finally released after withheld evidence was subjected to DNA testing and it was proved conclusively. The true perpetrator was a repeat murderer. And the prosecutor that withheld this evidence is now under trial. And if he loses, he may lose his legal license. Maybe. We have a system where the government has immunity. If the government commits a breach of the law, there's no adverse consequence. The state of Texas is prosecuting the federal government for some 20 cases. We've won 5. I read the judgments. I don't know how the judge could have written them in a more scathing manner. Reckless, irresponsible, words like this, that the EPA was completely ignoring the law and acting capriciously. What's the consequence? Anybody going to jail? Any EPA people going to lose their job? Any EPA people going to pay a fine? There's no consequence whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the recent EPA director who made the "we like to crucify people" comment, which did get him fired, said, these suits don't mean anything to us. All we'll do is just keep on doing it until we wear them down. So we've got a problem in that we have an improper definition of who the victim is. When the victim is the government, we lose liberty. We have an opportunity in this legislative session to start making some real progress on this. And Mark mentioned victim offender conferencing. This is just one step forward in what we can do to start bringing the victim into the circumstance and ask the victim, what would you like to see happen here? And start focusing on restoring the victim and restoring the victim's sense of well-being. Many times, especially in property crimes, what the victim wants to see is remorse and restitution on the part of the offender. If it's graffiti or destruction, community service, an apology, that's more restorative for the victim than throwing the guy in jail, where they get recruited by who knows what gang. I mean, the gangs are starting to send people to jail on purpose because it's a low-cost training exercise for them. So we got a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress and we have a lot of momentum. So I'm looking forward to this morning to hear what the panelists have to say, and would just encourage you, if you believe in liberty, if you believe in conservative values, criminal justice should be high on your list of things to care about. We historically, as conservatives, have sort of assumed that everything's okay, and if somebody's in jail, they deserve to be. You might not think that when they throw you in jail because you've been inconvenient. I'm also involved with a watchdog group, accountability group, and we had an ethics complaint filed against us for not being filed as a lobbyist. The ethics complaint was, the evidence they offered was a blast email that goes out to thousands of people that also went to a state legislator. Pretty spurious. It's still out over our heads. It was filed by 2 standing legislators that are committee chairmen who provide the funding for the Ethics Commission. So here we are, a citizen watchdog group, and the people who are being watched who don't like it, using the instrument of government to pound us, okay? So there's some things wrong with our system, and we as citizens are the ones that need to stand up and say, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be protecting, and you're supposed to be serving us. That's the purpose of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Our next speaker, and I want to thank her immensely for, actually it was last evening, we learned that one of the speakers we invited had fallen ill and couldn't be here, so it was incredibly gracious of our next speaker, Stephanie Froge, Stephanie Froge, I'm trying to get the last name right, but to come here at such short notice and be with us. And she is really one of the foremost experts on victims' issues in this state. She's Assistant Director at the Institute for Restorative Justice and Restorative Dialogue at the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work. And she works with her colleague Marilyn Armour, and they've done really tremendous research around victim-offender dialogue and how that can lead to greater victim satisfaction and a positive resolution for everyone involved. She has over 30 years of experience in the area of trauma response, victim services, victim assistance, activism. She's the former National Director of Victim Services at Mothers Against Drunk Driving's national office, where she oversaw their internationally recognized victim services programs. And she has held many other positions as well. She serves on the board of the American Society of Victimology and on the board of the Texas Victim Services Association. She's also a trained mediator. And so she has many studies going on currently, including a study on defense-initiated victim outreach and a number of other important areas of research. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie Froge.
Well, good morning. And John, you have my permission. I'm going to keep an eye out, but if I miss the cues, you can jump up and down and scream and yell. Well, good morning. I'm not Gordon Bazemore, which is too bad for you, but is great for me because I'm really happy to be here, and happy, Mark, because I'll milk this for decades, so don't worry about that. But what I think Gordon was going to share with you about, and what Mark asked me to share with you about, is a little bit of an overview maybe of restorative justice. And what Tim talked about was the perfect segue into a little bit of information about a philosophy, a way of thinking about harm, a way of thinking about crime, as well as sort of principles of practice, then how we might implement that particular philosophy that is in fact a little bit different from traditional criminal justice sorts of responses. And restorative justice is a principle that says that when harm has occurred, those who are most impacted by that harm are the ones that should be front and center in responding to that harm. I want to be very clear. Restorative justice is not a call to overthrow the criminal justice system, that it should be done instead of the criminal justice system. Not at all. It should, the philosophy says it should be an ancillary, sometimes it is in place of or instead of the criminal justice system, but certainly not always. But that it is simply another way of considering harm and reminding us that those most impacted by it should be front and center, should be core to any kind of response to that harm. It is so kind of intuitive, I think, that it is easy to dismiss it as somehow being soft on crime. What is this, some kind of kumbaya, hug-a-thug initiative? And restorative justice is not those things. Restorative justice is absolutely about accountability, because it does bring the people most harmed, most impacted by the harm, front and center to any response. But it's about meaningful accountability. Restorative justice believes that harm is fundamentally a violation of relationships, and that harm, anything that violates those relationships, carries with it certain obligations and responsibilities, often mostly on sort of the head, if you will, of the person who caused the harm, the offender. And that restorative justice seeks to hear what that harm is and to put right whatever can be done to put right related to that harm. Howard Zehr is kind of the sort of grandparent, if you will, of restorative justice in the United States. Many other countries have been doing restorative justice for a lot longer than we have. So frankly, if you look at the research, if you look at the data, you will see that the United States is not first in line in any of this, that much of what we know and much of what is practiced routinely around the globe is done in other countries. But Howard Zierl is really the grandparent of restorative justice in the United States, and he puts it very succinctly, and I like how he says, that the criminal justice process asks three questions. What laws were broken? Who broke them? And what do we do with them? What's the appropriate punishment? Whereas restorative justice asks those questions a little bit differently. Restorative justice asks, what harm has taken place? How do we repair that harm? And whose responsibility is it to repair that harm? I'm not going to give you a lot of sort of data and statistics and so forth, partly because I don't have them in the forefront of my head, and partly because that's not what I want to spend my time doing. But I want you to know that in this time when we talk about empirically based practices, important, we want evidence-based practices. That, along with fiscal cliff, is a term probably we're all heartily sick of. But it's important. Evidence-based practices. We need to be doing things that we know work. The time of experimentation and anecdotal evidence, we can't afford it right now, just economically. So we do need evidence-based practice. There's more information on restorative justice out there than almost any other kind of intervention. There's mountains of data. There's reams of data that show us kind of however you want to measure it. Restorative justice has very positive outcomes. Now, let me be really clear. It is not a silver bullet. It is not a panacea. I don't have a fetish about it. It is not appropriate in, certain kinds of cases. And restorative justice also, always has to be utilized strategically and after evaluation and so forth and so forth. So don't hear me suggest that this is the answer to all criminal justice problems. But nonetheless, we have the data that shows that however you want to measure it, restorative justice has extremely positive outcomes for people. We have a client satisfaction rate, by client we mean victim survivors, of 90% satisfaction, far higher than people are satisfied with the criminal justice system. Asking both victims and offenders who participate in some kind of restorative justice initiative, and restorative justice takes many forms. I'll talk about victim-offender dialogue here in just a minute, but it can be applied in a myriad of different ways. But when asked about fairness, people agreed with that the process had been fair. Both the victims and the offenders, 80 to 90% of the time. We saw one study recently that said 72% of those who participated said that they would recommend it to somebody else who had been victimized. Restitution is repaid at 90% greater likelihood that the defendant will repay the restitution. Recidivism, which is, of course, always kind of the gold standard in criminal justice research, is does the offender do it again? Recidivism in many categories is considerably less than control groups in which the defendant did not go through some kind of criminal justice process. And now, surprisingly, recidivism rates are even lower in what we call non-custodial crimes, in situations where it was not likely that the jail time, prison time wasn't even on the table. In this time of very legitimate concerns about costs, restorative justice initiatives are generally a lot less expensive than more traditional criminal justice processes. So that is an important piece that we need to look at. But speaking as a victim advocate, I want to emphasize this, that in probably all of the sort of cost-cutting measures that we look at and in evaluating different initiatives, we look at, what is the impact on the offender? Are we getting the most for our dollar as it relates to the offender? How is this impacting the offender, and can we do it cheaper, or can we do away with it, or whatever, to save money? Restorative justice is the one initiative where you get a twofer. You impact both the victim and the defendant. And just because victims' needs are not a line item in the budget the same way that, you can look up and see how much it costs to put somebody in prison. We can quantify all of that, and we have those in our state budgets, in our local budgets, whereas we don't have victim expenses in our budgets. But criminal victimization costs us money. And I was looking at some stuff last night in anticipation of sharing with you this morning, and this is just a few little things from actually our friends at Sam Houston State University who recently published a piece on the cost of criminal victimizations. Victims have 22% more doctor's visits the year following their victimization than non-victims. Their medical costs in the first year after their victimization are 2.5 times higher than non-victims. More than 11% of crime victims, more than 10% of crime victims lose 11 or more days of work in the year following their victimization. Victims of violent crime, somewhat less than 10%, lose their jobs, just flat lose their jobs for one reason or another. These have very quantifiable economic realities: lost productivity, lost educational attainment, being able to impact society in a positive way, being able to maintain positive kinds of relationships. We know that being the victim of crime is directly correlated with depression, with anxiety, with post-traumatic stress disorder. We know depression is directly linked to things like drug use, unemployment, and suicide. Those all have very real costs to them. So anything that we can do to reduce, and I should add too, in all those measurements that I talked about, recidivism, client satisfaction, we have data that shows positive mental health outcomes for the victims of crime who participate in restorative justice initiatives as well. I should say, Tim, you gave a really good kind of historical overview of sort of how the government came to be the victim. And it's easy to sort of think, well, in the United States, that's always. It was actually not until the 1970s, I don't remember if it was 72 or 74, that the Supreme Court ruled that the victim of crime was not a party in the adversarial process. But really, until the mid-70s, the assumption was that the victim of crime was a party. That is in sort of the history of the criminal justice field in the United States. That's a relatively recent philosophical change in how we do business. And yes, indeed, the criminal justice system is set up to do some things very, very well and very effectively, and it does. But meeting victim needs is not one of those things. If you've ever been through mediation training, you're probably familiar with what we call the PIN pyramid, and PIN stands for positions, interests, and needs. And what the criminal justice system does is it keeps people, and in conflict in general does this as well, not just criminal justice, keeps people at the positions level. I want X, you want Y, we're in conflict. It's generally a zero-sum game. If I gain something, you probably lose something, and generally only one of us is going to win. But we know that the positions represent what we call interests, what those positions represent. And for victims of crime, it may be things like answers to questions, feeling empowered, love the word of this particular workshop, feeling safe in their world again, things like that. And that really came home to me this week when I was reading about the competency hearings that are going on this week for Mr. Holmes in Colorado, the man who is believed to be responsible for the shootings in the theater in Aurora, Colorado. That victims of crime were quoted in some of those articles as saying, we want him to go to trial because we want our questions answered. Well, as a victim advocate, I want to reach out to those people and say, nothing wrong with wanting to go to trial, nothing at all, but your needs aren't going to be met. The criminal justice system, the process, the trial, whatever happens, is not going to answer your questions. So one of the beauties of the restorative justice process is it gets beyond positions and it asks victims, what do you need? What do you want? What harm happened to you? And how is it that we might be able to repair that harm in a creative and inclusive kind of fashion? So thank you very much, and I look forward to some continued dialogue.
Well, our final final speaker today is Ellen Halbert, who is one of the foremost experts on victims' issues in the state and Director of Victim Services at the Travis County District Attorney's Office, which is an office that's had a long history of pursuing restorative justice approaches. She began her career in victim services subsequent to violent crime against her back in 1986 rather. During her recovery, she began speaking out about strengthening victims' rights here in Texas. In 1991, she was appointed by Governor Ann Richards to a 6-year term on the Texas Board of Criminal Justice, and she was the first victim survivor ever to be appointed to that board. She's been recognized throughout the United States for her work as a survivor and as a restorative justice practitioner. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Halbert.
Well, of course, after Tim and Stephanie, I really don't have anything to say. It's really funny, when I found out Gordon couldn't come, I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to talk about restorative justice. Of course, Tim did. So I rewrote everything thinking I was going to have to talk about it, and I'm not the expert in it at all. And then Stephanie came on, so I scratched that out. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to talk about, but I am so glad to be here and hear this kind of conversation get started and hear people talk about doing more and more and more in the world of restorative justice, because I could tell you, after being a victim of a violent crime where I shouldn't have lived, the doctors couldn't believe I did, I am absolutely interested in giving victims a hugely loud voice in the criminal justice system. I'm very blessed in Travis County because we do have a restorative justice kind of focus to our office. Although we know that the state is the victim, our victims don't feel that way. They believe that they are victims because that's how they're treated in our office. Now, one of the most important things that you have to do to give victims a voice is sometimes you have to find them. We make that a focus in our office. We send out letters. And we ask for them to call. If they don't call, we start looking for them. We have a little process in our division, the Victim Services Division, where we can find them. If that doesn't work, we bring in an investigator and they try and find them. If we find a location but we don't have a phone, we go out to see them. We do every single thing possible to find a victim because we want to know what they have to say. We want their voices to be heard. Now, one of the good things about our office here in Travis County is that even when I came to work there, we had more counselors than most offices in large counties had. We had, oh gosh, I guess we had 4 or 5 when I got there, and every time we've gotten a new court, we've gotten a new counselor, and then when we go to Commissioner's Court, because we can prove that we have way more victims to handle than we can possibly cover, they'll give us another one. We have been very, very blessed. But I'm going to tell you, you never have enough. The counselors in our office work very long hours, and a lot of times when everybody else is gone, we're still there calling victims, trying to give them their rights, encouraging them to come to court. We do a very, very good job. Before I came to work for the Travis County, you saw in my bio that I was a member of the Board of Criminal Justice, and that gave me an opportunity to travel a whole lot, actually all over the United States, and I learned so much about victims and offenders in the prison system, probation, parole, state jails, treatment facilities. But it wasn't until the last couple of years that I was on this board I started learning about restorative justice. And I went to these conferences, and I'd hear victims talk about meeting with their offender and how incredible it was. They talked about it as being the best healing you can ever imagine. And so the more I heard, the more I wanted to do it with my offender. Oh my gosh, it just became a passion for me. I wanted to meet with him because I wanted to ask all those questions that victims want to ask, that they'd never get a chance to ask in the courtroom. Now, I already knew that if I got this opportunity, some of the questions that I'd want to ask, like why or what were you thinking, the offender would probably say, my offender, and most offenders say, I don't know. I don't remember. I can't put words to that. But in order to meet with me, they'd have to admit guilt. But I really wanted to do it anyway because I knew just the fact that I could sit there and look at him face to face and ask those questions, even if I didn't get an answer, I got to do that. So there was a mediator from Texas Department of Criminal Justice Victim Services who went to the prison to talk to him to see if he would meet with me, and he wouldn't. He was not in any way ready to accept responsibility for his crime. So I took the training. I thought, well, I can't do this, so I'll take this training, and I'll do it for other people. And it's not the typical kind of mediation training that you hear about. This training is to work with victims and offenders and victims who've been victims of violence. So it's a little bit different than most of the mediation programs you hear about. Now, after that, the very next year after I took that training, I went to work for the DA's office. I never thought I'd be able to use this training there. It just never occurred to me, but they were very clever at realizing what kind of training I'd had, and before I knew it, I had cases stacked up on my desk. They asked me to look at this and see, would this be a good, what we call them, conversation case? I've never turned one down. I have done hundreds and hundreds of conversation cases. Now, what I do in my office is I work with first-time offenders. But it's first-time offenders who've admitted guilt, but they have a victim. And we're really glad they admitted guilt, but we talk to the victim, talk to the offender, always meet with them ahead of time, maybe talk to them several times, and I'll ask the victim, would you really like to go talk to this offender and tell him how what he did hurt you, made you feel, affected you, and affected the other people in your family? I've never had one turn me down. And the offenders, on the other hand, I let them know what part they have to play and that they have to be good listeners. Everybody treats each other with respect. Amazing. I've never had a failure, and I've done hundreds and hundreds. I did one yesterday afternoon. I leave there, I don't even want them to leave. It's so powerful what I experience being in that room with them. It's just the three of us. And I always leave there thinking that I'm walking about 2 feet off the floor. So if I want to make a recommendation on giving victims a voice, first of all, in any prosecutor's offices, have as many victim counselors as you can. It's really hard to do it these days because there's just not enough funding. But whatever you need to do, get grants, whatever you need to do, but have them there available because, as I say, giving victims a voice is finding that victim, working with the victim, preparing them for court, and we do a great job of it. But I would also say, get your counselors trained. Well, I'd first say, please pass that bill, the victim offender mediation bill. But if that doesn't happen, get training for your counselors. The training that I took isn't available anymore because the budgets were cut. But I'm working with the School of Restorative Justice and Restorative Dialogue at UT that Stephanie, who did all my speech for me, where she works, and we're going to try and put something together. But all over the state, you just think about what we could do if we had counselors trained, this kind of training, very sensitive, very impactful training to be able to facilitate conversations with victims and offenders. And I have one more other thing that I'd like to say. It is my hope that as we move forward that people open their minds to new ideas. We came up with, and working with the Institute for Restorative Justice and Restorative Dialogue, that's a mouthful, a program called DEVO, Defense Initiated Victim Services. Great idea. Now, in our office, we have a lot of counselors, but we don't have counselors that can do everything, and a lot of victims want to know about that offender. I've heard it so many times. So this was going to be, it is going to be, it's working, a process where a person totally removed from the defense attorney goes in and talks with the defense attorney. Anyway, they work with the victim to answer their questions they have about an offender. You would have thought that, I can't even think anything, that we were talking about declaring war on victims. People didn't like the word defense. We wish we could have changed it. So they wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't get involved. They wouldn't go to training. They wouldn't take part in it at all, just to even see if they liked it. So it's not just this program, it's a lot of other programs. As programs evolve, I can remember when the whole entire criminal justice system thought it was going to fall because victims got rights. Well, it worked out, didn't it? There's a lot of other things that we can do, but people have to open their minds to new ideas. Anyway, I thank you for inviting me today. I've had a good time being here, and I get to brag about my office, and I get to brag about this incredible process that I get to do, and I'm just hoping that the bill is passed, and then we still get people in our offices trained, because we could do so many more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, at this time, we do have some time available for questions from the audience, so I believe, I'm not sure how we're going to structure it, but I guess, do we have a microphone? Okay. So just raise your hand and go ahead and.
Thank you. Hi, Tim. I'm Glenda Kane. It's nice to finally meet you. Thank you for having me today. I think from the perspective of someone who has been a public policy advocate for 35 years and has been involved as an appointee of the governor for quite some time now, that victims that we're not looking at are being perpetrated by governmental staff. And I know that there's a gotcha in our regulatory departments, in the Texas Medical Board, and someone needs to speak up in this state and say that the criminalization isn't always a crime, as Tim said, with the EPA. The criminalization is not always an offense against a single human being that is, what's the word I'm looking for?
Personal crime.
Personal crime.
Interpersonal crime.
Thank you. So I think that as the Texas Public Policy Foundation, one thing that we need to do is to look at what are we doing in government to criminalize our citizens in the regulatory and other agency ways.
Yeah, maybe Mark can talk about, there's actually, 1,500?
Yeah, 1,500 offenses in Texas outside of the penal code, and so those are things like 11 felonies relating to harvesting oysters, those sorts of offenses. And so, one of the things we need to do is go through all of those, have some sort of commission process or something to identify. Many of them, of course, are just antiquated or overlapping. There's a whole statute on industrial homework that has various offenses, and we still don't know what that is. But it really is out of control. And then, of course, you have some offenses that say any violation of any rule by a licensing board, for example, is a Class A misdemeanor, which is punishable by up to a year in jail. And so when you have those sorts of offenses that say any violation of a rule by a board, an unelected board, of course, that means every time that regulatory agency or that board meets, they can create new offenses essentially out of whole cloth. And so those are all these then non-statutory offenses that have just essentially been made by rules of a board, and very hard to keep up with that. And that's one of the whole things about criminal law, is it should give people fair warning about, so it's clear what is criminal. And frankly, you should be able to fit all our criminal laws on one page front and back. It's kind of like the Ten Commandments, but we're obviously a long ways away from being able to do that.
Yeah, and we do have an initiative to do that. Tryon Lewis, I hope, will be the legislative champion for that, and it's something that, it may take more than one session, but it's one of our priorities. We call it overcriminalization as just a general. Sorry?
It's never been a priority of Mark to bring the legislator a one-page bill on criminalization.
We
You can work on that, Jerry. That'd be your, okay. You can get a bonus if you can get that.
That's right.
Yes, I am a victim of violent crime and property crime, and goes back 20 years ago. Now, I say I'm a victim, that is pursuant to our statutory definition in Texas of what constitutes a victim. And now, my case is unique, or somewhat unique, in that the perpetrators of the crime were employed on our tax dollars. They were acting in the name of the state of Texas, in the name of our government, in perpetrating their crime. Now, it's an adjudicated fact that I've been a victim. And I have, so for the past 20 years, I've done a lot of research, a lot of study, and I've been involved a lot. And have come to the realization that what we have created is a so-called criminal justice system that cares really nothing about the so-called victims or the so-called perpetrators. It's a system that's all about getting money out of the taxpayers, keeping a lot of people employed at public expense, an excessive number of police officers, an excessive number of prosecutors, an excessive number of judges, an excessive number of prisons. Because there are hundreds of thousands of people and businesses that supply these public sector businesses with our tax dollars. And as a result, we have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. And yet, when someone like Michael Morton or me is the victim, and we ask for restitution, we're told that the state, the government, is above the law. And they seem to have forgotten the original principles, and that is that the purpose of law is not to protect a private citizen from a private citizen. The purpose of law is to protect the accused from the government. The person who has been wronged by another person, one of the things I found out in these various discussion groups over the past 20 years, it's amazing that so many people out in the public do not know that if a private citizen can bring an action for civil damages against somebody that they believe has violated the penal code, it doesn't have to be the government. It goes back to the original when we didn't even have public paid prosecutors.
There's actually a lot of precedent for that going on around the world, isn't there?
Well, I mean, let's, did anyone else want to, there's a lot of interesting points there. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, why don't you just comment on some of the, like you said, in the original founding, it was actually mostly private parties.
Right, and that, obviously, it was somewhat of a different society then, but I mean, certainly, I think a lot of the things, and you look at these 1,500 offenses we have outside the penal code, a lot of them either we don't need at all, or they could be civil. So somebody can sue somebody else, and obviously there's problems in our civil justice system, but, the criminal justice system is where you can lose your liberty, where you have a conviction that's on your record for the rest of your life that might prevent you from getting a job or renting an apartment. I mean, the criminal justice power is the most severe power that government can wield. So, and, we talked about these licensing agencies. You can take somebody's license away. You can fine them. There's a lot of other things you can do besides criminal penalties. We've actually created a checklist, Analyze Before You Criminalize, that lists the factors that we advise state legislators, and we also have a version for Congress. There's over 4,500 federal offenses now, that here are the factors you should consider, and one of those, of course, is whether there is actually an individual victim or not. And then we came out with a sequel to that called 12 Steps for Overcoming Overcriminalization, which provides some ideas on actually reining in the extravagant number of laws we have currently. So, yeah, thank you for your comments.
Didn't you tell me that actually the school, there was Class C misdemeanor for chewing gum or something like that?
Well, yeah, we could, that was, we've had every year about 300,000 or more citations are issued to school kids in Texas in public schools. And so what and Jerry Madden will remember this because he's the one who got the bill passed that we work with him on, but some of those citations were like a 10-year-old getting a ticket for chewing gum, and that was because in the Chapter 37 of the Texas Education Code, which deals with school discipline, it said schools could designate any violation of their code of conduct as a criminal offense. And so, therefore, you had that occur. So we still have a problem now, even though Chairman Madden got that bill passed in '07, which said schools could no longer create their own crimes. We have disrupting classes, which is most of the 300,000 citations, and that is defined so broadly. For example, making unreasonable noise is a disruption of class. So a lot of kids, as I certainly could have, got to get tickets for making unreasonable noise. And so, I think this Newtown thing is actually an opportunity to say, the reason we put all these police in schools to begin with is to protect the kids there from intruders from outside the campus. And unfortunately, because it's convenient for, school administrators and others to just have these citations be given out like lollipops, but it doesn't, there's no evidence it changes behavior. The kid months later goes to municipal court. All the municipal court can do is do a $500 fine, which the parent pays. And so it's silly. But so actually, Chairman Whitmire is going to have a bill this session which goes further in really restricting these citations and also rolling back some of the ineffective zero tolerance policies. So we're very excited about that. A bill did pass last session we worked on which said sixth graders and below cannot be issued citations. Now, if a fifth grader assaults someone, we'll just take them bring them to juvenile court. But these citations for this minor misbehavior are really counterproductive.
And Mark, I would add, those citations actually do change behavior. It makes it less likely that they'll finish school. It reduces, their educational success. It increases the likelihood that they will enter the criminal justice system as both a juvenile and adult. It changes behavior, but not the way we want it to.
Yep.
Gets them used to being a criminal?
Yep.
I'd like to add to that, too, that Minnesota always had restorative justice in schools. And once again, restorative justice is an answer to a lot of this. It's just to get people to try it. Well, we can wish. I don't know if we can put that in legislation, but I wish we could.
Well, Colorado actually did pass a bill that places restorative justice into schools. So peer mediation is one of the examples, which in some districts in Texas are using peer mediation. Okay.
When I was in junior high, we had restorative justice. They sent you to the coach's office and they paddled you, and it always restored me just fine.
Thank you for the panel. One of the problems, I think, and you get back to the philosophy of all this stuff, these people who commit crimes don't come from outer space. We are developing them in our neighborhoods today. They are dropping out of school. They have abuse and neglect as a child. They have drugs and alcohol in the family. They have fatherless households. And of course, in my position, there's no spiritual life left. Why do we say that? Because the only way we get them out of this thing, get their spiritual life in order. But that is a problem. And what you're doing with the restorative justice is putting a face on the crime. We do not put a face on the crime, especially in the where we have capital punishment. People just whisked off someplace and they do not put a face on the crime. When you put a face on the crime and there's agony and pain and suffering and everybody gets to enjoy that, then we recognize what the problem is here. But that's where we need to go. We need to go back. You all need to be going all the way back to the friggin' first grade to help get these freaking kids where they're supposed to be,
Well, thanks, Dutes. Dutes does some great work here in Austin with the Catholic Diocese, so I commend you for that. Did anyone want to address that?
I just have a quick question, and I may have missed it in the flurry of my note-taking, but Ms. Halbert, you were talking about getting the bill passed. Which bill specifically were you talking about, and are there any other bills that we need to be paying very close attention to this session?
Mark, you want to talk about the bill?
Sure. Well, it appears there'll probably be two bills that would, right now it's unclear whether victim offender conferencing is as a diversion. In other words, so the prosecutor gets this case and they see, okay, an 8-year-old in my neighborhood stole something out of my garage. Well, we could have this case go on for 6 months or a year and, go to court and all this stuff. Or, I'd be happy to sit down with that 8-year-old and say, I caused you to do this, I'd like that item back. And, we have a binding agreement for restitution, community service. And, only in the rare cases where that isn't performed, then does it go to the traditional prosecution. And so, but that's what these bills would say. Prosecutors can refer cases to victim offender conferencing, and it's not clear under current law whether that can be done. And they would not force prosecutors to make such referrals. But I think, and certainly if you look at places this is used, obviously New Zealand is probably the place where it's used the most, but very similar legal system to ours, but also Minnesota and other jurisdictions, that this can actually make life easier for prosecutors by getting a number of cases off of their caseload. And so our hope is, have this legislation go through, which is very similar to legislation that passed unanimously in both chambers in 2009 and then just died in a conference committee a day before the end of the session. So there's one bill that's already been filed by Ruth Jones McClendon, and then a slightly different bill that's in Legislative Council that we believe Tryon Lewis is going to file. And so, we were able to, at the end of the last legislative session, reach consensus on some language that's in the Representative Lewis's bill, reach consensus with prosecutors on that, and that had been the issue before. And so my understanding is, there's some, large DA's offices in Texas that have expressed, they say, well, they don't have time to look at review cases to determine which ones might be appropriate for victim offender conferencing. And so I think that probably indicates there's probably an effort they need to improve the intake and review process. I mean, what we see is, what we just hear anecdotally is in a lot of large DA's offices around the country, that a lot of times these cases sit there a long time. And I think if they can be, you have a triage and you get some cases that are like the case I just mentioned, that doesn't need to sit there and can really be taken off folks' plate pretty quickly through a restorative process, I think actually that they'll find it to be quite efficient over time. And we've heard from DA's offices in Colorado and other jurisdictions where this has been a real benefit to them in that regard. So in any case, I'm optimistic one of these bills will go through this session. There's also some other issues this session that are going to be of a lot of concern to victims, which include, as many may have seen, there have been some articles about the insolvency that's approaching with respect to the Victims' Compensation Fund. And also, I think one of the things we need to look at is giving victims a greater role in plea bargaining. I was reminded about this when you brought that up, Ellen, because in Arizona, I was just out there giving a speech about a month ago, but Arizona passed a law many years ago, and then New Jersey Governor Chris Christie just signed a law that gives victims some role of participation in plea bargaining discussions, so they're at least informed about what's going on. It's not a veto power, but in a lot of jurisdictions, 80 or 90% of cases are resolved by plea bargain. So you have a long list of rights victims have in court, but it doesn't end up really amounting to anything because the case has already been resolved. So in any case, what I was going to say about Arizona is, there were some concerns when they passed their law giving victims a right to be involved in the plea bargaining discussions, that would, some concern on the part of prosecutors, that would, gum up the process and such. And then, but the prosecutors there now all say this is working great. I just spoke with the county attorney, who's the district attorney in our definition in Texas, in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, and he said, this is working great. And so I think a lot of times, again, as Ellen said, sometimes there's a reticence to look at new ideas, but then once those ideas are implemented, it's like, gosh, this makes total sense.
Mark, if I may,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, may I say something about that mediation bill? And as ambassadors, I'm assuming since you're here, this is of interest to you, that it's nuanced, but it is important. Mediation, and I have no quarrel with using that word in a broad sense, but mediation is settlement-driven. It is most commonly used with people of equal power who have some kind of disagreement. Victim-offender dialogue is process-driven. And it is really important that if this bill gets passed, and I'm confident, I'm optimistic that it will as well, that practitioners, that people who then engage in these processes, help facilitate them like Ellen has done for so many years, understand and are trained in the difference. Not that I think mediators won't make great facilitators, I think many of them could be, but mediation is settlement-driven, and that is not what victim-offender dialogue is about. So my one concern or caution is just that these will get implemented and facilitated in ways that we know are not best practice. And so we all need to just kind of have that in the forefront of our minds and be thinking creatively about how do we ensure if this bill is passed and things are being implemented, or even if it's not and things are being implemented, that it's being implemented in best practice ways.
Let me just say something real quick about that I think is maybe applicable to the audience here, is that it was embedded in what Mark said there, but if you didn't catch it, most of the reason these bills don't pass is because of the DAs opposing it. So, and one of the things that they're concerned about is their re-election campaign, and there's kind of been a knee-jerk sort of someone can claim soft on crime, they automatically lose kind of thing that's been out there. And soft on crime, you know, can be claimed basically if the government's ability to throw people in jail even wantonly is affected. And so I think as discerning activists, you can discern whether, you know, we're moving to, you know, excuse people for the responsibility for their behavior, which is soft on crime, and say, no, we're not going to do that. Or if we're going to actually hold the government accountable and have them serve the citizens and promote liberty, which is anything but soft on crime, and to make a distinction between those things. And I think if we can start doing that, especially in our local DA races, we can start reducing some of the friction we have to make our criminal justice system more liberty-based.
Yeah, let me just wrap up here. I think we're about out of time, but I appreciate.
Quick comment on that.
Okay.
Soft on crime,
Yeah.
that's a big, huge myth. Texas is tough on crime. The truth is, Texas is not tough on crime. It's just a question of who our system allows to commit the crime. If you are employed at the expense of the taxpayers, you are free to commit crimes wantonly, openly, and others will conspire with you in the commission of those crimes and additional crimes.
Well,
A lot of the people that are in our prisons and have been run through this machine we've created are victims of crime. But they think that only private citizens can be criminals, and people employed at public expense are somehow pure,
Okay.
incapable
Thank you,
of
Ed.
committing crime.
one more question down here, sir.
I got a little lost in the bushes.
Okay.
I'd like to know the number of whatever bills y'all are
Okay.
advocating.
Good.
I-
That's good.
so we
You got a bill
can
number yet?
watch for which is right and which is wrong.
Good.
Sure. Well, I know at least one of them is still at legislative council being drafted, but I can get you, I believe we can look up I think the McClendon bill's already been filed, so
You can get that for.
I'll get it for you.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne.
But I want to thank everyone for being here. It's been a great discussion, and hope to see you at some of we've got 3 more panels on criminal justice, including 2 more today, one on overcriminalization, which we already touched on quite a bit, and then also one on adult corrections reform, and then tomorrow we've got one on juvenile delinquency and juvenile justice. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you later today.
Thank you.